On the morning of November 3, 1979, a postal worker named Gerald Hutchins noticed something odd about the mail sorting patterns at the McLean, Virginia processing facility, where he had worked for the past 14 years. 3 separate letters, all addressed to different recipients in the Washington metropolitan area, had arrived bearing identical postmarks from a small town in upstate New York called Lewiston, population 2,800. And all 3 envelopes contained the same unusual weight distribution when he hefted them during his sorting routine. The letters were slightly heavier on one end, as if something small and dense had been placed in the corner before sealing. It was the kind of detail that most people would never notice, the kind of asymmetry that only someone who had handled millions of pieces of mail over the course of a career would register as abnormal. Gerald set the 3 letters aside and continued his shift, and by the time he clocked out that afternoon, he had nearly forgotten about them. But 11 days later, when 3 more letters arrived with the same postmark, the same weight distribution, and addresses that corresponded to government employees working in sensitive positions across the capital region, Gerald decided it was worth mentioning to his supervisor. That conversation would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil during the final decade of the Cold War, a network that had been functioning undetected for nearly 8 years, and that had successfully recruited and run a minimum of 14 assets embedded within the Defense Department, the State Department, and 3 major defense contractors. The network would come to be known in classified FBI documents as Operation Lewiston, and by the time federal investigators finished unraveling it, in the spring of 1982, the case had resulted in 11 arrests, the expulsion of 6 Soviet diplomats, and a fundamental reassessment of how the KGB was using seemingly innocuous small-town America as cover for espionage operations that targeted the most sensitive corners of the national security apparatus. Gerald Hutchins was 46 years old in November of 1979, a quiet man with thinning hair and reading glasses that sat perpetually crooked on his face because the left arm had been bent slightly out of alignment years earlier, and he had never bothered to get them fixed. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in Arlington, having divorced his wife in 1974 after 12 years of marriage that had produced no children and increasingly little conversation. His life revolved around routines, the same breakfast every morning, eggs and toast and black coffee, the same route to work, the same lunch break spent reading paperback westerns in his car, the same evening ritual of a frozen dinner heated in the oven while he watched the network news. He was the kind of person who faded into the background of any room, whose presence was noted only in his absence, whose personality seemed to have been erased by decades of performing repetitive tasks that required precision but not imagination. But Gerald possessed something valuable that he himself did not fully recognize, which was an almost photographic memory for patterns. He could tell you which routes produced the highest volume of mail on any given day of the week. He could identify irregular handwriting or unusual postage choices. He could sense when something was off in the flow of letters and packages that passed through his hands, even if he could not always articulate what specifically was triggering his attention. This ability made him an excellent postal worker, reliable and efficient, the kind of employee supervisors appreciated but rarely praised because competence was expected rather than celebrated. The letters that caught Gerald's attention on November 3rd were unremarkable in most respects. Standard white business envelopes, typewritten addresses, first-class stamps properly affixed. But the postmark bothered him, not because there was anything inherently suspicious about mail originating from Lewiston, New York, but because his mental catalog of mail flow patterns told him that Lewiston was not a place that generated much outgoing correspondence to the Washington area. Small towns in upstate New York typically sent mail to Albany, to New York City, to other parts of the Northeast. The fact that 3 letters had arrived on the same day all from Lewiston, all going to different addresses in the metropolitan D.C. area, represented a statistical anomaly. And the weight distribution, that subtle imbalance he felt when handling each envelope, suggested that whatever was inside was not simply a folded letter. Gerald's supervisor, a man named Donald Krebs, who had been with the Postal Service for 27 years and who approached most problems with a combination of bureaucratic caution and deep skepticism about anything that deviated from established procedure, listened to Gerald's observation with the kind of polite disinterest that suggested he had heard stranger theories from postal workers experiencing the slow psychological erosion that came from sorting mail for decades. Krebs told Gerald that people mailed things from all over the country for all kinds of reasons, that the weight distribution was probably just uneven folding of the paper inside, and that unless Gerald had reason to believe the letters contained something illegal or dangerous, there was no cause for concern. The conversation ended with Krebs reminding Gerald that the Postal Service had a responsibility to deliver mail, not investigate it, and that speculation about the contents of sealed correspondence was both inappropriate and potentially a violation of federal law. Gerald returned to his workstation feeling vaguely foolish, the way a person feels when they raise a concern that others dismiss as paranoia or overreaction. He completed his shift without further incident and went home to his apartment, where he heated a Salisbury steak, TV dinner, and watched Walter Cronkite deliver the evening news with the authoritative gravity that made Americans believe they understood a world that was in reality far more complicated than 22 minutes of broadcast journalism could convey. The incident with the letters receded into the background of Gerald's consciousness, filed away in whatever mental compartment held things that seemed important at the time but proved to be nothing worth remembering. Except that, on November 14th, 3 more letters arrived. Same postmark, Lewiston, New York. Same typewritten addresses, this time going to a different set of recipients in the Washington area. Same unusual weight distribution that Gerald felt the moment he picked up the first envelope. He sorted them mechanically, placed them in the appropriate bins for delivery, and said nothing to anyone because he had learned from his previous conversation with Krebs that raising concerns without evidence led nowhere except to the conclusion that you were wasting everyone's time. But Gerald did something else. He wrote down the addresses. He used a small notebook that he kept in his jacket pocket, the kind with a spiral binding at the top and pages that were slightly yellowed from being carried around for months, and he recorded the 3 addresses exactly as they appeared on the envelopes, along with the date and the postmark details. He was not sure why he was doing this. He had no plan for what to do with the information. He simply felt compelled to document what he was observing, to create a record that would exist outside his own memory in case the pattern continued and in case it turned out to mean something. Over the following weeks, more letters arrived. Not every day, not even every week, but with enough regularity that Gerald began to anticipate them. November 28th, 3 letters. December 12th, 3 letters. December 19th, 2 letters. Each time he recorded the addresses in his notebook, and each time he sorted the mail without comment and watched it move through the system toward its intended recipients. By early January of 1980, Gerald had documented 17 letters, all originating from Lewiston, all going to different addresses in the Washington metropolitan area, and all exhibiting that same subtle weight imbalance that his hands detected even when his eyes saw nothing unusual. On January 8, 1980, Gerald made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the rest of his life, though he did not know it at the time. He called the FBI. He used the payphone outside a 7-Eleven near his apartment because he did not want the call traced back to his home phone, though this precaution was based more on instinct than any real understanding of how investigative procedures worked. He dialed the main number for the FBI's Washington field office, a number he had looked up in the phone book the previous evening, and when the operator answered, he asked to speak with someone in counterintelligence. The operator, a woman with a nasal voice that suggested she had answered thousands of similar calls and found most of them to be wastes of her time, asked what this was regarding. Gerald said he had information about suspicious mail patterns that might be related to foreign intelligence activities. There was a pause, the sound of typing, and then the operator told him to hold. 3 minutes passed, during which Gerald stood in the cold January evening watching cars pull in and out of the 7-Eleven parking lot, exhaling clouds of visible breath and wondering if he was about to make an enormous fool of himself. Then a man's voice came on the line, calm and professional, identifying himself as Special Agent Martin Dressler and asking Gerald to explain his concern. Gerald described the letters, the postmarks, the weight distribution, the fact that over the course of 2 months he had documented 17 pieces of mail that all followed the same pattern. He explained that he had been a postal worker for 14 years, that he knew mail flow patterns better than most people, and that what he was observing did not fit any normal explanation. Dressler listened without interrupting, and when Gerald finished, the agent asked several questions. Had Gerald opened any of the letters? No. Had he examined the envelopes closely enough to determine what might be causing the weight imbalance? No, he had only felt it during sorting. Had he noticed any other patterns, such as the names of the recipients or the specific neighborhoods where the letters were being delivered? Gerald said he had written down all the addresses and could provide them if the FBI was interested. Dressler's tone shifted slightly at this, becoming more focused, more engaged. He told Gerald that what he was describing was worth looking into, and he asked if Gerald would be willing to meet in person to discuss the matter in more detail. Gerald agreed, and they arranged to meet the following afternoon at a coffee shop in Arlington, a neutral location where 2 men having a conversation would not attract attention. Special Agent Martin Dressler was 38 years old in January of 1980, a 12-year veteran of the FBI who had spent the majority of his career working counterintelligence cases, the slow, methodical investigations that rarely made headlines, but that formed the backbone of American efforts to identify and neutralize Soviet espionage operations. He was a patient man, deliberate in his approach, skeptical by training, but open to information from unconventional sources because he understood that some of the best intelligence came not from sophisticated surveillance technology or high-level informants, but from ordinary people who noticed things that did not fit. When Gerald Hutchins walked into the coffee shop on January 9th, carrying a worn spiral notebook and looking like a man who half expected to be laughed out of the room, Dressler recognized him immediately as someone who was neither seeking attention nor fabricating stories for personal gain. Gerald was nervous but credible, the kind of witness whose observations, if they proved accurate, could provide the thread that unraveled something significant. They sat in a booth near the back of the coffee shop, and Gerald opened his notebook and walked Dressler through what he had documented. 17 letters over a 2-month period, all from Lewiston, New York, all going to addresses in the Washington area, all exhibiting the same physical characteristics. Dressler took notes on a small pad of his own, occasionally asking Gerald to repeat an address or clarify a date, his expression neutral, but his body language suggesting increasing interest. When Gerald finished, Dressler asked if he could borrow the notebook to make copies of the information, and Gerald handed it over with the hesitance of someone parting with something valuable. Dressler assured him it would be returned within 24 hours, and then he asked Gerald a question that caught the postal worker off guard. He asked if Gerald had told anyone else about his observations. Gerald said he had mentioned it once to his supervisor, who had dismissed it as irrelevant. Dressler nodded and told Gerald that moving forward, it would be important not to discuss this matter with anyone, including his supervisor, because if there was something to investigate, premature disclosure could compromise the inquiry. Gerald agreed, though he felt a small thrill of unease at being asked to keep secrets from his employer, as though he had crossed an invisible line into territory where the normal rules no longer applied. Dressler returned to the FBI field office and began the process of cross-referencing the addresses Gerald had provided with databases of government employees, contractors, and individuals who held security clearances. What he found was striking enough that by the end of the day, he had escalated the matter to his section chief, a woman named Catherine Morell, who oversaw counterintelligence operations in the Washington area and who had a reputation for being both brilliant and unforgiving of sloppy work. Morell reviewed Dressler's preliminary findings and made two decisions. First, she authorized a full investigation into the mail pattern Gerald had identified. Second, she instructed Dressler to determine whether the letters contained anything beyond standard correspondence, which would require obtaining legal authority to intercept and examine future mailings from Lewiston before they reached their intended recipients. Within a week, the FBI had secured the necessary warrants, and Gerald Hutchins had been quietly recruited as an informal asset, someone who would continue his normal work at the postal facility, but who would now alert Dressler immediately whenever another letter matching the established pattern arrived. On January 23, 1980, 3 more letters arrived, from Lewiston. Gerald called Dressler from the postal facility, using a phone in the supervisor's office after hours when no one else was present, and within 2 hours, FBI agents had retrieved the letters and transported them to a laboratory for examination. What they found inside the envelopes was not correspondence in any conventional sense. Each envelope contained a single sheet of paper on which had been typed a series of numbers and letters arranged in columns, approximately 200 characters per page, with no accompanying explanation or context. The paper itself was standard typing paper, the kind available at any office supply store, and the typewriter used to create the documents appeared to be a manual model, probably from the 1960s, based on the font characteristics. But it was what was hidden within the paper that made the letters significant. Embedded in the lower right corner of each sheet, beneath the typed text, was a microdot, a photographic image reduced to the size of a printed period, invisible to the naked eye, but detectable under magnification. The microdots contained additional information, also in coded form, and the combination of the visible typed text and the hidden microdot suggested a sophisticated communication system designed to pass intelligence between a handler and multiple assets without requiring face-to-face contact or risky dead drops in urban environments. The FBI's Cryptanalysis Division examined the coded text and determined that it used a substitution cipher of moderate complexity, the kind that would resist casual decryption, but that could be broken with enough time and computational resources. More importantly, the addresses to which the letters had been sent were not random. Of the 20 recipients identified so far, 14 were confirmed to be government employees or contractors with access to classified information. The remaining 6 could not be immediately verified, but preliminary background checks suggested they too had connections to the defense and intelligence sectors. This was not a coincidence. This was a network, and the letters from Lewiston were serving as a communication conduit between a handler, presumably operating from somewhere in the New York area, and a collection of assets who had been recruited to provide information to the Soviet Union. The investigation expanded rapidly. FBI agents were assigned to conduct surveillance on the identified recipients, monitoring their movements, their contacts, and their activities, without alerting them to the fact that they were under scrutiny. Simultaneously, a team was dispatched to Lewiston, New York, to determine how the letters were being mailed and who was responsible for sending them. What they discovered in Lewiston was both ingenious and infuriating in its simplicity. The letters were not being mailed by a Soviet intelligence officer or even by someone with obvious connections to foreign espionage. They were being mailed by an elderly woman named Dorothy Keene, age 71, who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town and who had been a resident of Lewiston for her entire life. Dorothy had worked as a librarian for 40 years before retiring in 1975, and she spent her days gardening, attending church, and volunteering at the local historical society. She was, by all appearances, exactly what she seemed to be, a kindly old woman with no interest in international politics and no connection whatsoever to the Soviet Union. But Dorothy Keene had a nephew named Robert Keene, age 44, who visited her approximately once a month, staying for a weekend and helping her with household repairs and errands. Robert lived in New York City, where he worked as a translator for a company that provided language services to businesses engaged in international trade. He was fluent in Russian, having studied the language at Columbia University in the 1950s, and he had made several trips to the Soviet Union over the years as part of his work, trips that were documented and appeared legitimate. What was not documented, and what would only become clear through months of painstaking investigation, was that Robert Keene had been recruited by the KGB in 1967 during one of those trips to Moscow, and that for the past 13 years he had been operating as a handler for a network of assets that he had carefully cultivated within the Washington intelligence community. The scheme was elegant in its design. Robert could not risk mailing letters directly from New York City to his assets in Washington, because that would create a traceable pattern that counterintelligence agencies might eventually notice. But if the letters originated from a small town in upstate New York, mailed by his elderly aunt, who had no connection to espionage, and who would never be suspected of involvement in anything more nefarious than overdue library books, the pattern would be far less obvious. Robert would visit Dorothy once a month, bringing with him pre-addressed envelopes and telling her that he was mailing business correspondence on behalf of his company. Correspondence that needed to go out with a Lewiston postmark for reasons related to corporate tax filings or legal jurisdictions, explanations that were sufficiently boring and bureaucratic that Dorothy never questioned them. She would take the envelopes to the post office, mail them as instructed, and never think twice about what she was doing. She was, in the truest sense, an unwitting accomplice, exploited by her nephew for purposes she could not have imagined. By February of 1980, the FBI had identified Robert Keene as the likely handler and had placed him under intensive surveillance. Agents monitored his apartment in Manhattan, his office, his travel patterns, and his contacts. They tapped his phone, intercepted his mail, and followed him during his monthly trips to Lewiston. But Robert was careful. He used payphones for sensitive communications. He varied his routines. He conducted himself with the kind of operational discipline that indicated professional training. The FBI could not simply arrest him without risking the exposure of the entire network, because they still did not know the identities of all his assets, and they needed time to gather evidence that would hold up in court. And so they waited, and they watched, and they allowed the operation to continue under controlled circumstances while they methodically built their case. The breakthrough came in March of 1980, when one of the coded letters intercepted by the FBI was successfully decrypted by the cryptanalysis team. The message, once decoded, contained instructions for one of the assets to photograph specific documents related to a classified Defense Department program involving satellite reconnaissance technology. The instructions were detailed, specifying which documents to target, how to photograph them, and when to pass the materials to Robert during a scheduled meeting in Washington. The FBI now had not only evidence of espionage, but advanced knowledge of a planned intelligence exchange, which meant they could position themselves to observe the meeting, identify the asset, and gather evidence in real time. The meeting was scheduled for March 19, 1980, at a location in Georgetown, a bookstore on Wisconsin Avenue that catered to academics and tourists, and that provided the kind of busy, anonymous environment where two people could meet without attracting attention. FBI surveillance teams were deployed throughout the area days in advance, agents posing as customers, street vendors, delivery drivers, anyone who would blend into the urban landscape. On the afternoon of March 19th, Robert Keene arrived at the bookstore at approximately 2:30, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a dark overcoat. He browsed the history section, pulled a few books from the shelves, flipped through them with apparent interest, and then moved to the philosophy section, where he continued his browsing. At 2:47, a man entered the bookstore, mid-30s, wearing a gray suit and carrying a folded newspaper. The FBI surveillance team recognized him immediately from their background investigations. His name was Kenneth Voss, and he was a mid-level analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency with a security clearance that gave him access to exactly the kind of satellite reconnaissance information that the decoded message had referenced. Voss and Keene did not acknowledge each other directly. They did not speak. They simply occupied the same section of the bookstore for approximately 6 minutes, during which time both men continued to examine books as though they were ordinary customers. But at one point, Voss placed his folded newspaper on a shelf, selected a book, examined it briefly, and then returned it to the shelf and walked away, leaving the newspaper behind. Robert Keene, seconds later, picked up a different book from the same shelf, glanced at it, set it down, and in the process retrieved the newspaper that Voss had left. The exchange took less than 3 seconds, executed with the kind of practiced smoothness that suggested it was not the first time they had conducted such a maneuver. Keene then purchased 2 books at the front counter, walked out of the store, and headed toward the metro station 3 blocks away. FBI agents followed both men, but they did not make arrests. Not yet. They needed to see what Robert would do with the materials he had received, needed to document the full chain of custody, needed to gather enough evidence to prosecute not just Kenneth Voss and Robert Keene, but the entire network. Over the following weeks, surveillance continued. Additional meetings were observed. More letters from Lewiston were intercepted and decoded. And slowly, painstakingly, the FBI constructed a comprehensive picture of how the network operated, who was involved, and what information had been compromised. By April of 1980, the FBI had identified 11 active assets within the network, ranging from low-level contractors with access to unclassified but sensitive information to senior analysts with top-secret clearances who had been passing documents to Robert Keene for years. The damage assessment, when it was finally completed, revealed that the network had compromised information related to satellite reconnaissance systems, secure communications protocols, assessments of Soviet military capabilities, and strategic planning documents that outlined American responses to various Cold War scenarios. It was not the most damaging espionage case in American history, but it was significant, and it had gone undetected for nearly 8 years because the communication method was so unconventional, and because Robert Keene had been smart enough to avoid the traditional patterns that counterintelligence agencies were trained to recognize. The arrests were coordinated to occur simultaneously on the morning of April 29, 1980. FBI agents executed warrants at the homes and workplaces of all 11 identified assets, at Robert Keene's apartment in Manhattan, and, in a moment that must have been particularly bewildering for an elderly woman in upstate New York, at the home of Dorothy Keene in Lewiston. Dorothy was not arrested, but she was questioned extensively, and it became clear very quickly that she had no knowledge of what her nephew had been using her to do. She was devastated when agents explained that the letters she had been mailing on Robert's behalf were part of a Soviet espionage operation, and according to agents present during the interview, she repeated over and over that Robert had always been such a good boy, that he had helped her with things around the house, that she could not believe he would do something like this. Dorothy Keene would die 18 months later, in October of 1981, from complications related to a stroke, and those who knew her said that she never recovered from the shame and confusion of learning that she had been an unwitting participant in espionage against her own country. Robert Keene was charged with multiple counts of espionage, conspiracy, and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. His trial, which took place in federal court in Manhattan over the course of 6 weeks in late 1980, revealed the full scope of his activities. Prosecutors presented evidence that Robert had been recruited by the KGB during a trip to Moscow in 1967, that he had been paid more than $400,000 over the course of 13 years, and that he had personally handled the recruitment and management of 14 separate assets, 3 of whom had not been identified before his arrest and were only discovered through documentation found in his apartment. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Robert Keene was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, and he would ultimately serve 27 years before being released on parole in 2007 at the age of 71. In interviews conducted years later, after his release, Robert maintained that he had acted out of ideological conviction, that he believed the Soviet Union represented a more just social order than the United States, and that his work had been in service of peace rather than aggression. These claims were met with skepticism by intelligence historians, who noted that the $400,000 he received suggested that ideology was at best a partial motivation. The 11 assets arrested in connection with Operation Lewiston received sentences ranging from 12 to 25 years, depending on the extent of their involvement and the sensitivity of the information they had compromised. Kenneth Voss, the Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who had been observed meeting Robert Keene at the Georgetown bookstore, received one of the longest sentences, 22 years, and served 16 before being released in 1996. Several of the convicted spies cooperated with investigators during debriefings, providing information about Soviet recruitment methods and tradecraft that proved valuable in subsequent counterintelligence operations. Others refused to cooperate, maintaining their silence either out of continued loyalty to the ideology that had motivated them or out of fear of what cooperation might cost them in terms of their personal safety. Gerald Hutchins, the postal worker whose observations had initiated the entire investigation, was never publicly identified. The FBI kept his name out of all court documents and media reports, protecting his identity both for his own safety and to preserve the possibility that he might be useful in future investigations. He continued working at the McLean postal facility until his retirement in 1992, and according to FBI records, he provided tips on 3 other occasions about suspicious mail patterns, though none of those tips led to cases as significant as Operation Lewiston. Dressler, the FBI agent who had taken Gerald's initial call and who had served as the case agent throughout the investigation, later said in a classified debriefing memo that Gerald's contribution was incalculable, that without his willingness to document what he was observing and to come forward with that information, the network would likely have continued operating for years, possibly indefinitely. The FBI offered Gerald a monetary reward for his assistance, a payment authorized under a program designed to incentivize civilian cooperation in national security matters, but Gerald declined, saying that he had simply done what any citizen should do when they noticed something wrong. The case of Operation Lewiston became a training example within the FBI and other intelligence agencies, studied for what it revealed about the creativity and patience of Soviet intelligence operations, and about the importance of remaining alert to patterns that deviated from the expected. It also reinforced a lesson that counterintelligence professionals had learned many times before, but that bore repeating, which was that some of the most effective espionage networks were those that avoided the flashy tradecraft of brush passes and dead drops in favor of methods that were boring, bureaucratic, and easily overlooked. A Soviet handler operating out of New York City, using his elderly aunt in a small upstate town to mail coded letters, was not the stuff of spy novels, but it was exactly the kind of unglamorous, methodical approach that could function successfully for years without detection. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the individuals arrested and prosecuted. The operation prompted a comprehensive review of security protocols at the Defense Department and related agencies, leading to changes in how classified information was handled, how employees with security clearances were monitored, and how patterns of potential compromise were identified. It also contributed to a growing awareness within the American intelligence community that the Soviet Union was placing increasing emphasis on what were called illegal operations, espionage activities conducted by officers operating without diplomatic cover, who could not be easily expelled if discovered, and who often used creative methods to avoid the traditional surveillance and counterintelligence measures that targeted diplomats and known intelligence officers operating out of embassies. For Dorothy Keene, the revelation that her nephew had used her to facilitate espionage was a trauma from which she never recovered. Neighbors in Lewiston described her as becoming increasingly withdrawn in the months after Robert's arrest, refusing to leave her house except for necessities, avoiding contact with people who had been her friends for decades because she could not bear the thought that they knew what had happened or that they judged her for her unwitting role in betraying the country. The historical society where she had volunteered stopped calling her to help with events, not because anyone blamed her, but because the association with the case made the organization uncomfortable in ways that no one wanted to articulate directly. Dorothy's health declined rapidly, and when she died in October of 1981, the funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people, a stark contrast to the community presence she had maintained throughout her life. Her obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of the espionage case, referring to her only as a retired librarian who had lived a quiet life devoted to her community. The story of Operation Lewiston is ultimately a story about how espionage functions not through the dramatic confrontations depicted in popular culture, but through the exploitation of trust, the manipulation of ordinary systems, and the patient accumulation of small advantages over long periods of time. Robert Keene did not steal nuclear codes or photograph missile plans. He recruited mid-level employees who had access to valuable but not earth-shattering information, and he created a communication system that was boring enough to escape notice for nearly a decade. His success depended on his aunt's trust, on the assumption that mail from a small town in upstate New York was inherently innocent, and on the fact that most people do not pay attention to patterns until someone like Gerald Hutchins decides that a pattern is worth documenting. Gerald Hutchins died in 2006 at the age of 73, having spent his retirement reading westerns and tending a small garden behind his apartment building. He never spoke publicly about his role in Operation Lewiston, and most of the people who knew him, including his ex-wife and the few friends he maintained, never learned that he had been involved in exposing a Soviet spy network. The FBI sent a representative to his funeral, a quiet gesture of respect. And in the years following his death, internal bureau documents declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the extent of his contribution, though even those documents redacted his name to protect his privacy posthumously. The recognition he received was the kind that comes only after a person is gone, and it existed primarily in the form of case files and training materials that future generations of counterintelligence officers would study without ever knowing the name of the postal worker who noticed that 3 letters from Lewiston weighed slightly more on one end than the other. The Cold War ended, as all wars eventually do, and the espionage networks that had operated during that conflict were gradually dismantled, their participants arrested or expelled or quietly retired by intelligence services on both sides. But the methods pioneered during that era, the patient cultivation of assets, the creative use of communication systems, the exploitation of ordinary infrastructure for extraordinary purposes, those methods did not disappear. They evolved, adapted to new technologies and new geopolitical realities, and continued to function in the shadows of a world that believed itself to be more transparent, more secure, more difficult to penetrate than the one that had preceded it. The story of Operation Lewiston serves as a reminder that vigilance is not paranoia, that attention to detail is not obsession, and that sometimes the difference between security and catastrophe comes down to whether one person in the right place at the right time decides that something is worth investigating rather than dismissing. Gerald Hutchins made that decision in November of 1979, and because he did, 11 people who had betrayed their country were brought to justice. A Soviet intelligence network was dismantled, and the systems that had allowed that network to function were reformed in ways that made similar operations more difficult in the future. It was not glamorous work. It did not make Gerald famous. But it mattered. And in the long history of the Cold War, with all its dramatic confrontations and existential tensions, it was the work of people like Gerald, ordinary people performing ordinary jobs who chose to pay attention, that often made the most difference.